The cannon waited in the fog, its black mouth aimed at a quiet harbor where the only sound was water lapping against wood. Most of America slept, unaware that before sunrise, the country would begin killing itself when the first shell soared toward Fort Sumter in April of 1861. It shattered more than stone walls. It shattered the illusion that compromise could hold the United States together forever. This wasn't just the start of a war. It was the violent, bloody end of a long and bitter argument. The American Civil War wasn't born in that moment of gunfire. It was born in ink, in whispered promises, and in uncomfortable silences that stretched back for decades. From the very moment the nation declared that all men were created equal, it carried a contradiction heavy enough to break it apart. The contradiction was slavery. It was a problem that was never solved, only postponed. Each generation passed the burden forward, hoping someone else would eventually have to deal with it. But time was running out. As the country expanded westward, every new territory, every new state, reopened the same old wound. Would it allow slavery or forbid it? Every answer pleased one side and enraged the other. Lawmakers tried to stitch the nation together with paper and glue. We had the Missouri Compromise, a line drawn across the map to separate free and slave territories. Then came the Compromise of 1850, another desperate attempt to balance the scales. Then the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which let settlers decide for themselves, effectively lighting a fuse. Each one was presented as a permanent solution, but each one only delayed the inevitable, making the final explosion even bigger. By the 1850s, America was no longer arguing quietly. It was shouting. In the territory of Kansas, pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers turned the fertile plains into a killing ground, a grim preview of the war to come. This was bleeding Kansas, and the violence wasn't just on the frontier. It spilled into the halls of power in Washington. Lawmakers traded threats instead of words. In a shocking moment, Senator Charles Sumner was nearly beaten to death with a cane on the Senate floor for condemning slavery. The attack was brutal, and it made one thing crystal clear. The nation's disagreements were no longer theoretical. They were personal, they were violent, and they were irreconcilable. The North and the South were becoming like two different countries, strangers living under the same roof. The North was industrializing at a rapid pace. Its cities swelled with factories, its landscape crisscrossed by railroads, and its population diversified by waves of immigrants seeking a new life. Its economy was dynamic, built on free labor and manufacturing. The South, on the other hand, remained overwhelmingly rural. Its wealth was tied to the land, but its entire economic and social structure was built on the backs of millions of enslaved people. Cotton was king, and slavery was the throne it sat upon. To question slavery, in the eyes of the South, was not just a moral debate, it was an existential threat to their entire way of life. Then came Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln's election in 1860 was the spark that ignited the powder keg. He was a moderate, a man who didn't call for the immediate abolition of slavery where it already existed, but he was firm in his belief that slavery should not be allowed to expand into the new Western territories. For many Southerners, that position alone was unforgivable. It signaled a future where their political power would dwindle, where their way of life would be choked off. When Lincoln won the presidency without carrying a single Southern state, it felt like a declaration of political war. It felt like extinction. The response was swift and decisive. One by one, Southern states began to leave the Union. They didn't see it as rebellion. In their minds, they were exercising their right to escape a government that no longer represented their interests. They were forming their own nation. The Confederate States of America was born, with its own president, its own constitution, and its own army. The Union, under President Lincoln, now faced an impossible choice. Let the states leave and watch the great American experiment crumble into pieces, or fight to preserve it, to hold the nation together by force. Lincoln chose to fight. He believed the Union was perpetual, unbreakable. But it would take a war to prove it, and so we return to that foggy harbor in Charleston, when Confederate guns finally opened fire on the Federal troops at Fort Sumter. The decision was made. There were no deaths in that initial 34-hour bombardment, but the sound of those cannons echoed across the continent, a deafening roar that signaled the end of peace. Men, North and South, rushed to enlist. Bands played patriotic tunes in town squares. Flags waved from every window. Many people, on both sides, believed the war would be short, a glorious adventure over by Christmas. They had no idea what they had just unleashed. They couldn't imagine the 4 years of bloodshed, the hundreds of thousands of lives that would be lost, and the deep, painful scars that would be left on the soul of the nation. The talking was over. The war had begun. The idea that the Civil War would be a short, glorious affair was shattered almost immediately. At the first Battle of Bull Run, what was supposed to be a decisive Union victory turned into a spectacle of panic and chaos. Soldiers who had marched off expecting an adventure found themselves in a frantic retreat. Civilians, who had gathered with picnic baskets to watch the battle from a safe distance, were swept up in the pandemonium, fleeing alongside the broken Union lines. This wasn't a grand parade. This was war in its raw, terrifying form. The rude awakening at Bull Run forced both the North and the South to confront a grim reality. This was not going to be easy. Both sides scrambled to build real armies from the ground up. Millions of men from every walk of life, farmers pulled from their fields, clerks from their desks, immigrants seeking a new start, and teenagers barely old enough to shave on the blue or the gray and marched into a future filled with uncertainty. They were about to face a level of destruction that no one could have truly anticipated. The technology of warfare had taken a terrifying leap forward. The traditional smoothbore muskets of past conflicts had been replaced by rifled muskets. These new weapons were accurate at much longer distances, turning what were once relatively safe open fields into deadly killing zones. A line of infantry could now deliver devastating fire from hundreds of yards away, mowing down attacking formations before they even got close. Artillery had also become more powerful and more precise. Shells filled with shrapnel could tear through ranks of soldiers, leaving behind a horrifying trail of bodies and limbs. The romantic image of charging cavalry and glorious bayonet fights was quickly replaced by the brutal math of modern firepower. While the weapons of destruction were advancing, the science of medicine was stuck in the past. The greatest killer in the Civil War wasn't a bullet or a cannonball. It was disease. The massive armies, living in crowded and often unsanitary camps, became breeding grounds for typhoid, dysentery, and smallpox. For every soldier killed in combat, two more die from sickness. Medical care was primitive by today's standards. Field surgeons worked in horrifying conditions, often without anesthesia and with no understanding of germ theory. Sterilization was non-existent. A wound that would be minor today could easily become a death sentence from infection. Amputation was the most common surgical procedure, a desperate attempt to stop gangrene from spreading. Simply surviving was often a matter of pure luck, despite their early victories and the fierce spirit of their soldiers. The Confederacy was facing a war of attrition it simply could not win. The South was an agrarian society, lacking the industrial might of the North. It had few factories to produce weapons, ammunition, and uniforms. Its railroad network was limited, making it difficult to move troops and supplies effectively. And perhaps most critically, it lacked manpower. The North's larger population and steady stream of immigrants meant it could replenish its armies and absorb staggering losses. The South could not. Every soldier lost was a blow from which the Confederacy struggled to recover. Yet, for a time, the South defied the odds. This was largely due to a handful of brilliant and audacious military leaders, chief among them Robert E. Lee. Taking command of the Army of Northern Virginia, Lee proved to be a master strategist and tactician. He consistently outmaneuvered and outfought larger Union armies, winning a string of stunning victories that boosted Southern morale. and kept the hope of independence alive. Lee became a legendary figure, a symbol of the Confederate cause. But his aggressive style of warfare came at a terrible price. His victories were incredibly costly, bleeding his army of men that the South simply could not replace. While the Confederacy had Lee, the Union struggled to find effective leadership. President Abraham Lincoln cycled through a series of commanders for the main Union Army in the East. The Army of the Potomac. These generals were often overly cautious, hesitating at critical moments and failing to press their advantages. They seemed intimidated by Lee's reputation, allowing him to dictate the tempo of the war. Opportunities to strike a decisive blow were squandered time and time again. Lincoln, watching from Washington, grew increasingly frustrated. He knew that the Union's material advantages meant nothing without generals who were willing to fight. He understood that something fundamental had to change if the war was ever to be won. That change came on September 17, 1862, on the rolling fields of western Maryland, near a small creek called Antietam. Here, Lee's army, bold from its recent victories, collided with the Union's Army of the Potomac in the single bloodiest day in American history. The fighting was savage and relentless. Battles raged in a cornfield, where men were cut down in rows like stalks of grain. A sunken country lane, later known as Bloody Lane, became filled with the bodies of fallen soldiers. The fighting swirled around a stone bridge for hours, as Union troops desperately tried to cross under a hail of Confederate fire. When the sun set on Antietam, the fields and woods were littered with over 23,000 casualties, men who were killed, wounded, or missing. The scale of the carnage was almost incomprehensible. The battle was technically a draw, but both armies battered and exhausted. But Lee's invasion of the North had been stopped, and he was forced to retreat back into Virginia. The illusion that the war could be won quickly or without immense sacrifice was gone forever. Antietam shocked both sides into the realization that this conflict would be a long, grinding struggle to the death. But the horrific bloodshed at Antietam gave President Lincoln something he desperately needed: a victory. It wasn't the crushing, decisive victory he had hoped for, but it was enough. It provided him with the political leverage he needed to make a move he had been contemplating for months, a move that would fundamentally transform the purpose of the war. 5 days after the battle, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. He declared that if the Confederate States did not rejoin the Union by the beginning of the next year, all slaves in the rebellious territories would be thenceforward and forever free. The war was no longer just about preserving the Union. It was now also a war to end slavery. This single act redefined the conflict, turning it into a moral crusade and ensuring that there could be no turning back. The stakes were now higher than ever. 5 days. That's all it took. 5 days after the brutal stalemate at Antietam, Abraham Lincoln seized the moment and issued a document that would forever change the course of American history: the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, let's be clear. This wasn't a magic wand that instantly freed every enslaved person in the country. It was a strategic military order aimed at the states in rebellion, but its impact was seismic. Suddenly, the war wasn't just about preserving the Union anymore. It was about something much, much bigger. It was now a war for human freedom. The United States was officially fighting against the institution of slavery itself. This single act completely redrew the lines, not just on the battlefield, but across the entire globe. Think about the international stage. The Confederacy had been banking on support from European powers like Britain and France. Their economies were heavily dependent on Southern cotton, after all. But both nations also had powerful anti-slavery movements. Public opinion was fiercely abolitionist. After the Emancipation Proclamation, how could the governments of Britain or France possibly justify supporting a nation explicitly fighting to preserve slavery? They couldn't. The proclamation made it politically impossible. Overnight, the Confederacy was diplomatically isolated. The South now stood well and truly alone, cut off from the foreign aid and recognition it so desperately needed to survive. But the most profound change happened right here at home. The proclamation opened a door that had been firmly shut. It declared that black men could now officially enlist in the Union Army. This was a monumental shift. For generations, black Americans, both free and enslaved, had been denied the basic right to fight for the country they lived in. Now, they could wear the Union blue and take up arms against the very system that had oppressed them. Thousands stepped forward. They came from the North, free men who had long campaigned for this right. And they came from the South, men who had just escaped the shackles of bondage, their freedom still raw and new. Imagine the courage this took. They knew the risks were astronomical. For a white Union soldier, capture meant being sent to a prison camp. For a black Union soldier, capture could mean immediate execution or being sold back into slavery, a fate arguably worse than death. They faced discrimination within their own army, too. They were paid less than their white counterparts, at least initially. They were often given the most grueling, backbreaking labor and the most dangerous combat assignments. Respect was a rare commodity. Yet, they fought. They fought with a fierce determination that few could match. Because they weren't just fighting for a country. They were fighting for their own freedom, for their families' futures, for the very soul of a nation that had for so long denied their humanity. One of the most powerful examples of this incredible bravery came at Fort Wagner, South Carolina. In July 1863, the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, one of the first all-black regiments raised in the North, was ordered to lead a frontal assault on the heavily fortified Confederate stronghold. It was a suicidal mission. They charged across an open stretch of sand into a hailstorm of cannon and rifle fire. The casualties were staggering. Their brave colonel, Robert Goldshaw, was killed alongside many of his men. The assault ultimately failed to take the fort, but in its heroic failure, the 54th Massachusetts achieved a monumental victory. Their courage under fire was undeniable. News of their valor spread throughout the North, shattering racist stereotypes and proving to a skeptical nation that black soldiers could and would fight with extraordinary skill and bravery. Their sacrifice forced America to confront a truth it had long tried to ignore, that the fight for freedom had defenders of all colors, willing to pay the ultimate price. As the war dragged on into its third and fourth years, the initial enthusiasm on both sides curdled into a grim, hardened resolve. The conflict was taking a terrible toll, not just on the soldiers, but on the civilians left behind. In the South, the Union blockade was strangling the economy. Port cities were cut off, and crucial supplies couldn't get in. The Confederacy's own infrastructure was crumbling under the strain of war. Railroads broke down, making it impossible to transport what little food there was to the cities and the armies. Widespread food shortages led to rampant inflation. A simple loaf of bread could cost a week's wages. Desperate women, whose husbands and sons were away fighting, staged bread riots in cities like Richmond, breaking into shops and warehouses to feed their starving children. The romantic ideal of a glorious Southern cause was dissolving into a daily struggle for survival. The North wasn't immune to hardship either. While its industrial economy was booming for more production, the human cost was becoming unbearable. The seemingly endless casualty lists published in newspapers brought the horror of the war into every community. In 1863, the Union implemented its first military draft, a move that proved deeply unpopular. Wealthy men could legally pay a substitute to fight in their place or simply pay a fee to avoid service altogether. This led to the bitter cry that it was a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. In cities like New York, resentment exploded into violence. The New York City draft riots were among the deadliest urban insurrections in American history. For days, mobs rampaged through the streets, attacking draft offices, symbols of wealth, and, tragically, the city's black population, who they blamed for the war. The riots exposed deep, ugly fractures within the Union itself. This growing despair created a massive political problem for Abraham Lincoln. The war was costing too much, in both blood and treasure. The Union armies seemed stalled. General Ulysses S. Grant was bogged down in a brutal siege at Petersburg, Virginia, losing thousands of men for what seemed like inches of ground. General William Tecumseh Sherman's army was advancing through Georgia, but its final objective was unclear. Support for the war plummeted. A powerful peace Democrat movement gained momentum, calling for a negotiated settlement with the Confederacy. Lincoln himself became deeply pessimistic about his chances for re-election in the fall of 1864. He privately wrote that it seemed exceedingly probable that this administration will not be re-elected. The fate of the Union and the future of millions of newly free people hung precariously in the balance. It felt as though the entire grand, bloody project was on the verge of collapse. And then, just as despair reached its peak, fate, strategy, and sheer will converged on a small, unassuming town in southern Pennsylvania, a place whose name would soon echo through eternity: Gettysburg. This was where the war would find its turning point, and where the nation's destiny would be decided. The Battle of Gettysburg. It's a name that echoes through history, a moment so pivotal it feels like it must have been meticulously planned, a grand showdown set by generals poring over maps. But the truth is, it was an accident. It began as a scramble for supplies, a chance encounter. To massive armies, the Union's Army of the Potomac and the Confederacy's Army of Northern Virginia were maneuvering through Pennsylvania. The Confederates, hearing rumors of a shoe supply in the small town of Gettysburg, sent a division to investigate. What they found instead was Union cavalry. What started as a minor skirmish on July 1, 1863, quickly escalated. Both commanders, Robert T. Lee for the South and George Meade for the North, recognized the strategic importance of the high ground around the town. They hurried their forces to the fight. What was supposed to be a supply run exploded into the largest and bloodiest battle ever fought on American soil. For 3 brutal days, the hills, ridges, and fields around Gettysburg, names like Little Round Top, Cemetery Hill, and the Devil's Den, became scenes of unimaginable horror and heroism. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and the screams of the wounded. The first day saw the Union forces push back through the town, but they managed to secure the strong defensive positions on the high ground south of Gettysburg. The second day was a whirlwind of Confederate assaults on both flanks of the Union line. The fighting was desperate, hand to hand in many places, as Union soldiers fought with grim determination to hold their ground. Each Confederate attack was repulsed, but at a terrible cost to both sides. The Union line bent, but it did not break. By the morning of the third day, July 3rd, Lee knew he was running out of options. His attacks on the flanks had failed. He decided on a desperate, audacious gamble, a massive frontal assault against the center of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge. It was a move born of confidence, or perhaps desperation. He believed his Virginians were invincible. That one more powerful push could shatter the Union Army and win the war. Around 1 in the afternoon, the battlefield fell silent. Then, the ground began to shake. Nearly 170 Confederate cannons opened fire in the largest artillery barrage of the war, trying to soften the Union defenses. For 2 hours, the air was filled with a deafening roar and exploding shells. When the bombardment finally ceased, the smoke cleared to reveal a truly terrifying sight. Nearly 12,500 Confederate soldiers, arranged in a line almost a mile wide, began marching out of the woods and across a vast, open field. This was Pickett's charge. They marched with perfect discipline, flags flying, bayonets gleaming in the sun. It was a magnificent, yet suicidal, spectacle. The Union artillery, which had cleverly conserved its ammunition during the Confederate barrage, opened up with devastating effect. Cannon fire tore huge gaps in the advancing lines. As they got closer, Union rifle fire joined the chorus of death. The Confederates wavered, but they kept coming, pressing onward into a storm of lead. A small number, a few hundred brave men, actually managed to breach the Union line at a stone wall, a spot now known as the high water mark of the Confederacy. But they were too few, their support gone. They were quickly killed or captured. The charge was a catastrophic failure. The survivors stumbled back across the open field, a broken and defeated remnant of the proud army that had marched forward just an hour before. Lee, witnessing the disaster, rode out to meet his shattered troops, repeating, "It is all my fault." He had risked everything and lost. The Army of Northern Virginia had suffered a blow from which it would never truly recover. The next day, on July 4th, Lee began his sorrowful retreat back to Virginia. The invasion of the North was over. The Confederacy would never again be strong enough to launch a major offensive. Gettysburg was the beginning of the end. 4.5 months later, in November 1863, the battlefield was quiet again, transformed into a national cemetery. President Abraham Lincoln was invited to offer a few appropriate remarks at the dedication ceremony. The main speaker of the day had delivered a 2-hour-long speech. When Lincoln rose to speak, he held just a few notes. He spoke for only about 2 minutes. But in those 272 words, he did something profound. He didn't just eulogize the dead, he redefined the entire purpose of the war. He spoke of a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. He framed the bloody conflict not just as a fight to preserve the Union, but as a test to see if a nation founded on such principles could long endure. He urged the living to dedicate themselves to the unfinished work, for which the soldiers had given the last full measure of devotion. He concluded with a powerful vision of a new birth of freedom, ensuring that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The words were simple, elegant, and direct. Their impact was eternal. The Gettysburg Address transformed the war's meaning, lifting it from a political dispute to a moral crusade for the future of democracy itself. Following the turning point at Gettysburg, the nature of the war itself began to change. The Union, now under the overall command of a general who truly understood the grim arithmetic of victory, embraced a new and brutal strategy: total war. That general was Ulysses S. Grant. Grant was not a flashy strategist like Lee. He was a bulldog. His philosophy was simple: find the enemy, attack him as hard as you can, and keep moving forward. He understood that the Union's greatest advantages were its superior numbers and industrial might. He was willing to trade lives for momentum, knowing that the Confederacy could not afford to replace its losses, while the Union could. In the spring of 1864, Grant launched his overland campaign, pressing Lee's army relentlessly in a series of bloody battles in Virginia, the Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, Cold Harbor. The casualty lists were staggering. Many in the North were horrified, calling Grant the Butcher. But Grant never let up. He kept hammering away, pinning Lee's army down and bleeding it dry. He wasn't just fighting an army. He was fighting a nation's will to continue. Meanwhile, another Union general, William Tecumseh Sherman, put this philosophy of total war into devastating practice in the Deep South. After capturing the vital city of Atlanta, Sherman embarked on his infamous March to the Sea. His goal was not just to defeat Confederate armies, but to destroy the South's entire infrastructure and its ability to wage war. He cut a 60-mile-wide path of destruction across Georgia, burning buildings, tearing up railroad tracks, and confiscating supplies. His army lived off the land, destroying anything of military value they couldn't use. The psychological impact was as important as the physical destruction. Sherman wanted to make Georgia howl. He brought the war to the civilian population, showing them that their government could not protect them. He aimed to break their morale, to crush their spirit and hope. From Georgia, he turned north, bringing the same destructive campaign through the Carolinas. The goal was no longer just battlefield victory. It was complete and utter exhaustion of the enemy. By the spring of 1865, the Confederacy was collapsing from the inside out. Grant's relentless pressure had Lee's army pinned down in a siege at Petersburg, Virginia. Sherman's campaign had ravaged the heartland. The Union naval blockade had choked off foreign supplies. Confederate cities were starving. Its armies were shrinking, racked by desertion as soldiers left to go home and protect their families. The Southern economy had disintegrated. Hope, once so defiant, had faded into despair. The end was near. The grand, tragic experiment of the Confederacy was in its final, agonizing days. In the quiet spring of April 1865, a chapter of American history, written in blood and fire, finally drew to a close. At Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, to Generals Ulysses S. Grant of the Union and Robert E. Lee of the Confederacy met in a modest farmhouse. The scene was heavy with the weight of years of relentless conflict. Outside, the armies that had clashed across countless battlefields stood silent, waiting. Inside, there was no grand ceremony of triumph, no gloating from the victor. Grant, representing a nation weary of war, extended an arm of mercy, not a fist of vengeance. His terms were generous. Confederate soldiers would not be paraded as prisoners. They were simply to lay down their arms and would be allowed to return to their homes, to their farms, to whatever remained of their former lives. Lee's men could even keep their horses, Grant reasoned, for the spring planting. It was an act of profound grace, a signal that the goal was not to punish, but to begin the painstaking process of mending a shattered country. With the stroke of a pen, the killing stopped. A fragile peace settled over the land, a quiet so deep it seemed almost unnatural after the constant roar of cannon and musket fire. Across the nation, a collective sigh of relief was breathed. The war was over. The Union was preserved. But the moment of peace was tragically brief. Just 5 days after Lee's surrender, a single shot rang out in Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. President Abraham Lincoln, the man who had steered the nation through its darkest hour, was assassinated. The joy of victory was instantly swallowed by a profound and national grief. The bells that had just rung in celebration now told in mourning. A country that was just beginning to imagine a future of reconciliation was now leaderless, adrift in a sea of sorrow and uncertainty. The man who spoke of malice toward none, with charity for all, was gone, and with him, the clearest vision for how the divided states might once again become united. The nation mourned its fallen leader, even as the monumental task of rebuilding loomed before it. The end of the war was not an end to the struggle. It was merely the beginning of a new, and in many ways, more complex one. The war had settled one fundamental question. The secession was defeated, and the United States would remain a single, indivisible nation. It also brought about the single greatest social transformation in American history: the abolition of slavery. The 13th Amendment, ratified in December 1865, constitutionally ended the institution that had been the primary cause of the war. 4 million people who had been held in bondage as property were now, by law, free. It was a moment of liberation on a scale almost unimaginable, a promise of a new dawn of freedom. But the promise of legal freedom was not the same as the reality of true equality. The chains had been broken, but the deep-seated prejudices and economic systems built on centuries of exploitation did not simply vanish. The question was no longer if these 4 million newly freed African Americans were free, but what that freedom would actually mean. Would they have the right to vote, to own land, to receive an education, to be treated as equal citizens under the law? These were the questions that would define the next era. This era came to be known as Reconstruction. It was a period of breathtaking possibility and heartbreaking failure. For a brief, radical moment, it seemed as if the nation might truly remake itself. Under the protection of federal troops, black men were elected to local, state, and even national office. Public school systems were established for the first time in many parts of the South. The 14th and 15th Amendments were passed, granting citizenship, equal protection under the law, and voting rights to African American men. It was a revolutionary experiment in interracial democracy, an attempt to build a new South from the ashes of the old. But this progress was met with ferocious, violent resistance. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan launched campaigns of terror and intimidation to suppress the black vote and reassert white dominance. Slowly, the political will in the North to continue the difficult and expensive work of Reconstruction began to wane. By 1877, the last federal troops were withdrawn from the South. The promises of Reconstruction were abandoned. The transformation retreated, replaced by a new system of racial segregation and oppression known as Jim Crow. The wounds of the war, which had briefly seemed on the verge of healing, were torn open once more and left to fester for generations. The human cost of the Civil War is staggering to comprehend even today. The most common figure cited is that more than 620,000 soldiers died. But through it all, the United States did survive. It had faced the ultimate test and had not disintegrated. The Civil War answered a question that had haunted the nation since its very founding. That question was embedded in the Declaration of Independence, with its soaring rhetoric of all men being created equal, and in the Constitution, which simultaneously protected the institution of slavery. Could a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition of equality endure its own profound contradictions? Could a democracy survive a fundamental disagreement over its own meaning? The war provided the answer, yes, but that answer was delivered at a terrible, almost unbearable price. It affirmed that the nation was a permanent union, not a voluntary confederation of states that could leave at will. The principle of a strong central government, capable of upholding the ideals of the Republic, was firmly established. The conflict forged a new sense of national identity, one hardened in the fires of war and sanctified by the sacrifice of hundreds of thousands of its citizens. The United States began to be spoken of not as a plural noun, these United States are, but as a singular one, the United States is. Today, the cannons are silent. The battlefields are quiet parks, dotted with monuments and memorials. The soldiers who fought and died have long since turned to dust. But to think of the Civil War as merely a thing of the past is to misunderstand its enduring power. The echoes of those cannons remain with us. We hear them in our debates over states' rights versus federal power. We see their legacy in the ongoing struggle for racial justice and equality. We feel their presence in our very identity as Americans. The questions that drove men to fight at Gettysburg and Vicksburg are questions we still grapple with today. What does it mean to be an American? Who gets to be included in we the people? What are the responsibilities of citizenship? What is the true meaning of freedom? The Civil War was not just a war fought in the 1860s. It was, and in many ways still is, a struggle over the very soul of America, a battle over what this nation is, what it has been, and what it might still, one day, become. The work of building that more perfect union that Lincoln spoke of is a task that was left to us. The war ended, but its story continues, and we are all living in its next chapter. Thank you for watching this series on the American Civil War. If you found this journey through history meaningful, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. For more deep dives into the events that have shaped our world, hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next series. We appreciate your support. See you next time.